November 1720. A courtroom in Spanish Town, Jamaica, packed with spectators who've come to witness something unprecedented. Two pirates stand before the judge, both convicted of crimes on the high seas, both sentenced to hang. But when the judge asks if they have anything to say before execution, one of them steps forward and declares, "My lord, we plead our bellies." The courtroom erupts in chaos, because these aren't two male pirates. They're women, Mary Read and Anne Bonny, who've spent months fighting alongside men, fooling everyone, becoming two of history's most feared pirates. And now they're claiming pregnancy to avoid the noose. For Mary Read, this dramatic moment is just the latest twist in a life that began with deception, continued through warfare and romance, and transformed her from an illegitimate child forced to masquerade as a boy into one of the Golden Age of Piracy's most fascinating figures. But here's what makes her story truly extraordinary. She didn't just dress as a man to survive, she thrived, proving herself more capable than most men around her in battle after battle, on land and sea. This is the story of how one woman defied every expectation society placed on her, and why her legend still challenges us 3 centuries later. Let's begin in England, probably around 1685, though the exact date is uncertain because Mary Read's birth was deliberately obscured by the circumstances surrounding it. To understand why, we need to understand England in the late 17th century, a society with rigid class structures where legitimacy mattered enormously, where women had severely limited options, and where poverty could be inescapable without family support or inheritance. Mary Read's entire extraordinary life grew from attempts to navigate these constraints through deception that began before she could even remember. Mary's mother, whose name history hasn't preserved, was in a desperate situation. She'd been married to a sea captain who spent long periods away on voyages. During one of his absences, she'd given birth to a son. But then her husband died at sea, and shortly afterward, her son died as well, probably from one of the many childhood diseases that killed enormous numbers of children in 17th century England. She was left alone, widowed, childless, and facing poverty. Then she became pregnant again. The father wasn't her deceased husband. He'd been gone too long for that. The father was apparently someone she'd had a relationship with after her husband's death, though historical records don't identify him. This created a catastrophic problem. The child would be illegitimate, born to a widow without a husband, which brought enormous social stigma in 17th century England. Illegitimate children had no legal rights to inheritance, faced discrimination throughout their lives, and their mothers were often ostracized as immoral women. The baby was a girl, Mary. Her mother faced grim prospects. Raise an illegitimate daughter in poverty and social disgrace, or find some way to navigate the situation more cleverly. What she did next was audacious and morally questionable, but also desperately practical given her circumstances. She decided to pretend that Mary was actually her deceased son, that the boy hadn't died but had been away living with relatives, and now he was returning home. This deception served a specific purpose. Her late husband's mother, Mary's grandmother, had been providing financial support for her deceased grandson. If the grandmother believed the boy was still alive, she might continue providing that support. But if she learned he died and been replaced by an illegitimate granddaughter, the money would certainly stop. So Mary's mother made a calculated decision. She would raise Mary as a boy, presenting her to the grandmother as the surviving grandson, collecting the support payments, and gambling that she could maintain this deception long enough to secure their financial survival. From her earliest memories, Mary lived as a boy. Her mother dressed her in boys' clothes, cut her hair in masculine styles, taught her to move and behave as boys did, called her by a male name in public. We don't know exactly what name. Mark Read appears in some later accounts, though it might be speculation. What matters is that Mary's fundamental identity, the most basic question of who she was constructed as deception from the beginning. She learned that survival required pretending to be someone she wasn't, that her real self needed to be hidden, that the world wouldn't accept her as she actually was. How did this affect her psychologically? We can only speculate because Mary Read left no personal writings describing her inner experience. But living as a boy while knowing you were a girl must have created profound identity complications. Did she resent the deception? Did she eventually prefer masculine identity to feminine? Did she feel like she was performing a role, or did the role become genuinely part of who she was? These questions matter because they shape how we understand her later choices to continue living as a man, even when not strictly necessary for survival. The deception apparently worked initially. The grandmother continued providing support, believing she was helping her grandson. But such schemes rarely work indefinitely. As Mary grew older, continuing to pass as male became more difficult. Puberty would bring physical changes that couldn't be easily concealed. The grandmother might visit or demand closer contact that would make deception harder to maintain. And practically, what was the long-term plan? Mary couldn't live her entire life as a boy without eventually being discovered. At some point, sources disagree exactly when, the financial support from the grandmother ended, either because she died, or because the deception was discovered, or because Mary simply grew too old for it to be plausible. This left Mary's mother in poverty again, but it also left Mary with unusual skills and experiences. She'd spent years living as a boy, had learned masculine behaviors and attitudes, had discovered that she was capable of performing masculinity convincingly. These weren't common skills for women in 17th century England, but they were skills that would open possibilities otherwise unavailable. We should pause to consider what options young women had in Mary's time and social class. If you were born female into working class or lower middle class families in late 17th century England, your choices were severely limited. Marriage was the primary path to security, but it required finding a husband, which required a dowry or at least respectability, neither of which Mary possessed as an illegitimate child from a poor family. Domestic service, working as a maid or cook in wealthier households, was another option, but it paid poorly and offered little independence. Prostitution was always available, but dangerous and degrading. Honest labour like sewing or laundering existed, but barely provided subsistence wages. For boys, more options existed. Boys could become apprentices learning trades. They could join the military or navy. They could work as labourers, but with better pay than women doing similar work. They could travel, seeking opportunities elsewhere. Society invested in boys' futures in ways it didn't for girls, because boys would become men who mattered economically and politically, while girls would become wives whose primary value was reproductive and domestic. Mary apparently recognized this disparity and decided to continue her masculine masquerade even after the original financial motive had ended. If life offered more opportunities to males than females, and if she'd already learned to pass as male, why not continue? This decision wasn't just about practical advantages. It represented a profound rejection of the limitations society placed on women, a refusal to accept that her gender should determine what she could do or become. Her first significant employment as a young person was apparently on a British warship. The Royal Navy in the late 17th and early 18th centuries was constantly recruiting because naval warfare was central to British power, and because service conditions were harsh enough that recruitment was difficult. Ships needed sailors, and they weren't particularly careful about verifying the backgrounds of young men who volunteered. Mary, presenting as male, could join relatively easily. Life aboard warships was brutal, but also offered something that women rarely experienced: adventure, travel, escape from England's suffocating social structures. Ships sailed to distant ports, fought enemy vessels, participated in military campaigns across Europe and beyond. For someone like Mary, who'd grown up in poverty and limitation, the Navy represented freedom despite its dangers and hardships. And crucially, it was a completely masculine environment where her disguise would be tested constantly, but where discovery would be catastrophic. Naval regulations didn't accommodate women, and being discovered would mean immediate dismissal and probably worse. She survived and apparently thrived in this environment. The fact that she wasn't discovered suggests she was skilled at maintaining her disguise, not just in appearance, but in behavior, in how she talked and moved and related to other sailors. Naval life required physical strength, crude masculine banter, fighting ability, willingness to endure harsh discipline and dangerous conditions. Mary demonstrated all of this sufficiently that nobody questioned her gender, which is remarkable given the intimacy of shipboard life, where privacy was minimal and people lived in extremely close quarters. But naval service apparently wasn't her final choice. At some point, sources vary on exactly when, she transferred from the Navy to the Army, joining British forces fighting in Flanders, modern-day Belgium, during the War of Spanish Succession. This war, lasting from 1701 to 1714, pitted Britain and its allies against France and Spain over European power dynamics and Spanish succession after the death of the childless Spanish king. British soldiers fought numerous battles in the Low Countries, and Mary served among them as a cavalryman, a mounted soldier in one of the more prestigious military positions. Why did she make this transition? Perhaps she found army service more appealing than naval life. Cavalry positions offered slightly higher status than common sailors, and army encampments on land might have seemed preferable to months at sea. Perhaps she was discovered in the Navy and forced to leave, but managed to re-enlist in the army without her secret being revealed. Perhaps she simply sought new experiences. Whatever the reason, she continued her masquerade in a new context, continuing to prove that she could perform masculinity convincingly in even the most male-dominated environments imaginable. Her army service would prove crucial not just for developing military skills, but also for an unexpected reason. It was where she fell in love, where her secret was revealed, and where she experienced a brief interlude of living as a woman before circumstances forced her back into masculine disguise. But that's a story for the next episode. What matters here is understanding that by the time Mary Read was in her late teens or early 20s, she'd already lived an extraordinary life. Raised as a boy through deception, continuing that deception by choice, serving in both Navy and Army, fighting in wars, traveling across Europe, all while maintaining a secret that would have destroyed her if revealed. The girl who'd been hidden from birth was still hidden, but she was also becoming someone formidable. Someone who would soon face her greatest challenges and achieve her greatest fame. The foundation was being laid for the legend that would make her name immortal. Mary Read, serving as a cavalryman in British forces in Flanders, was successfully maintaining her masculine disguise in one of the most challenging environments possible. Military encampments where men lived in close quarters, where privacy was virtually non-existent, where any slip in performance could lead to discovery. She'd proven herself capable in combat, had earned the respect of fellow soldiers through courage and competence, and seemed to have established a secure place in masculine military culture. Then, something happened that would temporarily end her masquerade and give her a brief taste of a different life. She fell in love. The details are frustratingly vague because Mary Read left no personal account of her life, and what we know comes primarily from A General History of the Pirates, a book published in 1724 by an author identified as Captain Charles Johnson, possibly a pseudonym for Daniel Defoe, though scholars debate this attribution. That book provides the most detailed contemporary account of Mary's life, but it was written partly as sensational entertainment, and separating fact from embellishment is difficult. Still, the basic story about her romance in Flanders appears consistently across sources and has a psychological plausibility that suggests truth. Mary developed feelings for a fellow soldier, a young Flemish man serving alongside her in the cavalry. We don't know his name, don't know exactly when or how they met, don't know many specific details about their relationship. What we know is that Mary's feelings grew intense enough that she decided to do something extraordinary. She revealed her secret to him. This was an enormous risk. If he reacted badly, he could expose her to their commanders, which would mean immediate dismissal from the army and possibly criminal charges. Even if he didn't expose her maliciously, he might be unable to keep the secret, might tell friends, might allow the information to spread. Mary's entire life, the identity she'd carefully constructed and maintained for years, depended on his discretion and his reaction. Why did she take this risk? The most obvious answer is emotional intensity, love or attraction powerful enough that concealment became unbearable. But there might have been practical considerations too. If she wanted any kind of real relationship with this man, continuing to pretend to be male was impossible. The masquerade that had opened opportunities for her also trapped her in an identity that prevented certain kinds of intimacy and connection. If she wanted to be truly known by someone, wanted to be loved for who she actually was rather than who she pretended to be, revelation was necessary regardless of risks. His reaction, according to historical accounts, was positive. Rather than being horrified or feeling deceived, he apparently was impressed by Mary's courage, intrigued by her unusual story, and receptive to developing a relationship. This suggests he was an unusual man for his time. Most 17th century soldiers would have reacted with shock or anger or mockery at discovering their companion was female. His acceptance implies he had more flexible attitudes about gender and was able to see Mary as an individual, rather than just as a shocking violation of social norms. They decided to marry. This decision created immediate practical problems. Mary couldn't continue serving in the army as a woman. Military service was exclusively male. If she revealed her gender publicly to legitimize their marriage, she'd lose her military position and income. But continuing the masquerade while being married was impossible. Marriage was a public institution requiring visible female participation. They had to choose between Mary's military career and their relationship, and they chose the relationship. So Mary left the army. She revealed her gender to commanding officers, probably causing significant shock and scandal. The army presumably discharged her, though whether with honor or in disgrace isn't clear from surviving records. She began living openly as a woman for the first time since early childhood, abandoning the masculine identity she'd maintained for years, relearning how to navigate the world as female in a society that offered women far fewer opportunities than men. They married and decided to become innkeepers, a common occupation for retired soldiers and their wives. They used military savings and possibly loans to establish a tavern called the Three Horseshoes, near Breda in the Netherlands. This was a significant investment and represented a complete break from Mary's previous life. She'd gone from soldier to wife to businesswoman, from masculine to feminine identity, from adventure to domestic life. For a brief period, she seemed to have found stability and conventional happiness. Running a tavern required specific skills, but also offered relative independence. Taverns served soldiers, merchants, travelers, people passing through who needed food, drink, and sometimes lodging. A successful tavern could provide comfortable income. The work was demanding but manageable for a couple working together. Mary's military background probably helped attract soldier clientele who felt comfortable in an establishment run by fellow veterans. Her husband's local connections may have helped integrate them into the community. We don't know how long this period of domestic life lasted. Accounts suggest they ran the tavern successfully for a while, building a business and apparently building a life together. But this conventional existence couldn't last. Tragedy intervened. Mary's husband became ill and died suddenly. Different accounts mention different possible causes: fever, plague, other diseases that killed people rapidly in an era before modern medicine. Whatever the specific cause, Mary found herself suddenly widowed, possibly within just a year or two of marriage, before she'd fully adjusted to civilian life or established secure financial footing. His death was personally devastating, but also economically catastrophic. Running a tavern alone was much harder than running it as a couple. Male customers might not respect a female proprietor the same way they'd respected a veteran couple. Creditors might demand faster payment from a widow than from a married couple. Competition might intensify, and Mary, still relatively young, faced the question: what do you do when the conventional path fails? She could have remained an innkeeper, struggling to make it work alone. She could have remarried, widows often did, especially young widows with businesses to offer as dowry. She could have returned to England, sought family support, tried to build a different life. But Mary apparently decided on a more dramatic course. She would return to masculine disguise and seek opportunities that were available only to men. The brief period as a woman was over. The soldier was returning, though this time not to armies, but to seas. Why did she make this choice? Partly necessity. Running the tavern alone wasn't working financially, and she needed income. But partly choice. She'd experienced both feminine and masculine social roles as an adult, had seen directly what each offered, and apparently preferred the opportunities and freedoms available to men despite the dangers of maintaining the disguise. This suggests that Mary's masculine identity wasn't just convenient deception, but something more fundamental to who she was or wanted to be. She apparently sold or abandoned the tavern, used whatever money she had to purchase appropriate male clothing and supplies, and travelled to a port city, possibly Rotterdam or Amsterdam, to seek passage on a ship. The Dutch were major maritime powers, their ships sailing worldwide for trade and colonization. Signing on as a sailor was relatively easy for a healthy young man with military experience. Mary, resuming her masculine identity, found employment on a merchant vessel bound for the West Indies, the Caribbean islands that were becoming economically crucial through sugar plantations, trade networks, and increasing strategic importance to European powers. This decision to sail for the Caribbean was fateful in ways Mary couldn't have anticipated. The Caribbean in the early 18th century was the epicenter of the Golden Age of Piracy. Pirates operated throughout the region, attacking merchant ships, establishing bases on islands with weak government control, creating a maritime outlaw culture that attracted people from throughout Europe and the Americas. Mary was sailing directly into this world, though whether she knew it or intended it is unclear. She was seeking employment and adventure. She would find both, but in forms she couldn't have imagined. The voyage to the West Indies took weeks or months, depending on weather and routes. These were dangerous voyages, even under best circumstances. Storms could destroy ships, diseases could kill crews, navigation errors could result in being lost at sea. Mary had to maintain her masculine disguise constantly during this voyage, living in cramped quarters with other sailors, never relaxing the performance that protected her secret. By now, she'd probably been living as a man for most of her adult life, so the performance was deeply ingrained, but it still required constant vigilance. The ship apparently reached the Caribbean successfully and began trading operations, sailing between islands, buying and selling goods, the routine work of merchant vessels. But then something happened that would change Mary's life completely and set her on the path to piracy. their ship was attacked. Pirates spotted this merchant vessel, recognized it as a potential prize, and attacked to capture its cargo, money, and potentially the ship itself. The crew would have fought if they were armed and brave enough, or surrendered if resistance seemed futile. The merchant vessel was taken, its goods seized, its crew captured. Mary and other sailors faced a choice that pirates typically offered captured crews: join us or face consequences. Pirates needed sailors constantly because pirate crews were depleted regularly through combat, desertion, disease, and execution if caught by authorities. Forcing captured sailors to join pirate crews was common practice. Some sailors refused and were marooned, or sometimes worse. Others accepted, either from fear or because piracy offered better pay and more freedom than merchant service, even accounting for the risks. Mary apparently chose to join the pirates. This decision transformed her life for a second time. She'd gone from army soldier to innkeeper's wife to merchant sailor to pirate. An extraordinary sequence of transformations, even before considering that she was doing all this while maintaining the fundamental deception about her gender. She was about to enter the most famous phase of her life, the phase that would make her name immortal. But first, she needed to prove herself worthy of pirate acceptance, needed to demonstrate that she could fight and sail and survive in a maritime outlaw culture, even more dangerous and unforgiving than the military environments she'd already mastered. The soldier's love story was over. The pirate's legend was about to begin. When Mary Read joined a pirate crew in the Caribbean, probably around 1718 or 1719, she entered a world fundamentally different from both military service and civilian life. To understand what this meant, we need to understand the Golden Age of Piracy. What it actually was, why it happened, who the pirates were, and what their lives involved. Because the popular image of pirates from movies and novels often bears little resemblance to historical reality, and Mary's experiences can only be understood in accurate historical context. The Golden Age of Piracy lasted roughly from 1690 to 1730, with its peak period around 1715 to 1725. This was an era when European maritime commerce was expanding dramatically, when valuable goods flowed between Europe, Africa, the Americas, and Asia, creating tempting targets for maritime robbery. The Caribbean was particularly important because of sugar plantations that generated enormous wealth. Caribbean sugar was described as white gold, driving the entire regional economy and making merchant ships loaded with sugar, rum, enslaved people, manufactured goods, and money common throughout the region. Piracy thrived partly because of weak governmental authority. The Caribbean contained dozens of islands controlled by competing European powers: Spain, Britain, France, the Netherlands, plus many islands that weren't effectively controlled by anyone. Pirates could establish bases on islands where no government could expel them, then raid shipping throughout the region, retreating to their bases when pursued. Nassau in the Bahamas became the most famous pirate haven, essentially an independent pirate republic for several years before British authorities finally suppressed it in 1718. Who became pirates? Some were sailors from naval or merchant ships who mutinied or deserted because of brutal conditions. 18th century naval discipline included flogging, inadequate food, disease-ridden ships, and authoritarian command structures that gave officers absolute power over common sailors. Others were privateers who'd been authorized by governments to attack enemy ships during wartime, but continued those attacks during peacetime when their legal authorization ended. Still others were escaped slaves, debtors fleeing creditors, criminals avoiding punishment, adventurers seeking fortune, or simply desperate people for whom piracy seemed less terrible than their current situations. Pirate crews were remarkably democratic and egalitarian compared to naval or merchant ships. Pirates elected their captains and could depose them through votes if dissatisfied with leadership. They divided plunder according to agreed-upon shares, with captains receiving only slightly more than common crew members, rather than the enormous disparities between officers and sailors on legitimate ships. They created written articles, pirate codes, specifying rules, compensation for injuries, division of prizes, and crew behavior. This democratic organization attracted people who'd experienced authoritarian hierarchies elsewhere and wanted more equal conditions. But we shouldn't romanticize piracy. Pirates made their living through robbery that sometimes involved violence against crews of captured ships. They operated outside legal systems, which meant disputes were resolved through force rather than law. Life expectancy for pirates was short. Many died in combat, from disease, from accidents, or from execution if captured by authorities. And while pirate ships offered more equality than other maritime environments, they were still brutal places, organized around violence for profit. Mary joining a pirate crew meant entering this dangerous, exciting, egalitarian, but violent world. She had to prove herself capable immediately because pirates didn't tolerate incompetent or cowardly crew members. New recruits were tested, given dangerous tasks, judged on their performance in combat, evaluated for trustworthiness. Mary's military experience probably helped her pass these tests. She knew how to handle weapons, had faced combat before, understood military discipline and coordination. These weren't skills all pirates possessed, and demonstrating them would have earned respect. She also had to maintain her gender disguise among men who lived in extremely close quarters. Pirate ships were small, cramped environments where privacy was virtually impossible. Crew members slept in hammocks packed tightly together, performed bodily functions in primitive facilities or over the ship's rail, bathed rarely and only with seawater, lived in constant proximity that made concealing anything difficult. Mary must have developed sophisticated strategies for maintaining her secret. Perhaps she bathed privately when possible. Perhaps she bound her chest to conceal physical characteristics. Perhaps she adopted behaviors that discouraged too close examination. The specific pirate crew Mary initially joined isn't clearly identified in historical records. The Caribbean contained numerous pirate vessels operating independently or in loose confederations. Some captains became famous: Blackbeard, Edward Teach, Bartholomew Roberts, Charles Vane, and others whose names appeared regularly in colonial newspapers and government reports. Others operated more anonymously, successful pirates who simply never became famous enough for history to record their names clearly. What we know is that Mary spent months, or possibly a year or more, serving on pirate vessels, participating in raids and attacks, learning the specific skills that maritime piracy required. These skills overlapped with, but weren't identical to military skills. Sailing small vessels through dangerous waters required knowledge of winds, currents, navigation by stars and landmarks. Boarding enemy ships required different combat tactics than land warfare, fighting on unstable, moving platforms, using cutlasses and pistols effective in close quarters, coordinating attacks while managing sails and steering simultaneously. Mary apparently became skilled at boarding actions, the moments when pirates would get close enough to merchant ships to throw grappling hooks, pull vessels together, and jump aboard to overwhelm the defending crew. These actions required physical courage, combat skills, and quickness, because merchant crews would fight if they could, and falling into the water between ships meant almost certain drowning. Historical accounts describe Mary as fearless in such situations, always among the first to board enemy vessels, fighting with particular determination and skill. She also learned the economic side of piracy. Pirates needed to evaluate potential prizes, determining whether ships were worth attacking based on visible cargo, flags, routes, and other indicators. They needed to navigate complex decisions about whether to keep captured ships as additions to their fleet, or just take cargo and release the ship. They needed to sell or trade stolen goods, which required knowledge of ports that would buy from pirates without reporting them to authorities. Piracy was as much business as violence, and successful pirates understood both aspects. During this period, Mary served under various captains and encountered various crews, building reputation and connections within the pirate community. Pirates communicated with each other, shared information about government patrols and potential prizes, sometimes cooperated on major attacks, and generally formed networks that transcended individual crews. Mary's growing reputation as a capable fighter would have spread through these networks, making her known among Caribbean pirates even beyond the specific ships she served on. Then came the encounter that would define the rest of her life. She joined the crew of Calico Jack Rackham. John Rackham, called Calico Jack because he wore colourful calico clothing, was a moderately successful pirate captain operating around Jamaica and the Bahamas. He wasn't as famous or feared as Blackbeard or Roberts, but he commanded a capable crew and had achieved notable successes. He'd participated in the capture of a significant merchant vessel earlier in 1719, which brought him wealth and enhanced reputation. By late 1719 or early 1720, when Mary apparently joined his crew, Rackham commanded a sloop called William, with a crew of perhaps 20 to 30 men. But Calico Jack's crew was unusual in one respect. It already included one woman disguised as a man, Anne Bonny. And when Mary Read joined this crew, two extraordinary women would meet, form an alliance, and together create one of the Golden Age of Piracy's most famous partnerships. That meeting would change both their lives and would ensure that both their names would be remembered centuries after most male pirates were forgotten. But to understand that partnership, we need to understand Anne Bonny herself, who she was, how she came to be on Calico Jack's ship, and why her relationship with Mary Read became so significant. That's the story for our next episode. What matters here is recognizing that Mary Read, through courage, skill, and determination, had successfully navigated from captured merchant sailor to accepted pirate crew member, had proven herself worthy in one of the most dangerous, challenging environments imaginable, and was about to meet the person who would become her closest friend, fighting companion, and historical counterpart in a legend that would outlive them both. Before we can understand the extraordinary partnership between Mary Read and Anne Bonny, we need to understand Anne herself, because she was as remarkable and unusual as Mary, and their meeting brought together two women who'd both defied 18th century gender expectations in dramatic ways. Anne Bonny's path to piracy was different from Mary's, but it was equally extraordinary and equally revealing about the limited options society offered women, and what happened when women refused to accept those limitations. Anne Bonny was born in Ireland around 1697 or 1698, the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer named William Cormac and his maid. This scandal ruined William's legal practice and social standing in Ireland, so he immigrated to the American colonies, specifically to South Carolina, where he could start fresh without the stigma following him. He brought Anne and her mother with him, and he succeeded in establishing himself as a merchant and plantation owner, becoming quite wealthy through trade and possibly through slave ownership, which was common among South Carolina plantation owners in the early 18th century. Anne grew up in relative privilege compared to Mary's impoverished childhood. She had education, comfortable circumstances, and social position, though always shadowed by the illegitimacy that marked her origin. According to accounts, which may be exaggerated or embellished, Anne had a fierce temper from childhood, rebelling against feminine expectations, preferring physical activity to domestic pursuits, and showing violent tendencies that shocked contemporaries. One story claims she stabbed a servant girl with a knife during an argument, though whether this actually happened or was invented to make her seem more frightening is unclear. Her father apparently wanted her to marry well, to use marriage to overcome the stigma of illegitimacy and secure social position. But Anne, like Mary, refused to conform to expectations. She fell in love with a small-time pirate and sailor named James Bonny, a man her father considered completely unsuitable. Poor, disreputable, with no prospects for providing the comfortable life William Cormac wanted for his daughter. When Anne insisted on marrying James, her father disowned her, cutting off her inheritance and forcing her to choose between family wealth and her own desires. She chose her desires, married James Bonny, and they moved to Nassau in the Bahamas, which in 1718 was the pirate capital of the Caribbean. Nassau had been effectively taken over by pirates who used it as a base for operations throughout the region. The British government, concerned about losing control entirely, sent a new governor named Woodes Rogers in 1718, with authority to offer pardons to pirates who surrendered and to suppress those who didn't. Many pirates accepted the pardon and tried to transition to legitimate life. Others refused and continued pirating, either fleeing Nassau or operating secretly from there. James Bonny apparently wasn't a successful pirate. He was more of a hanger-on to pirate culture than a formidable pirate himself. He may have worked as an informant for Governor Rogers, betraying other pirates for reward money, which was a despised occupation even among people trying to go straight. Anne, stuck in a marriage that disappointed her with a husband she probably came to despise, began looking for escape and excitement elsewhere. That's when she met John Calico Jack Rackham. Rackham had accepted the pardon initially, but was apparently planning to return to piracy. He was charming, successful by pirate standards, and represented everything Anne's husband wasn't: confident, capable, exciting. Anne and Rackham began an affair, which in 18th century terms meant Anne was committing adultery, a serious offence that could result in punishment if discovered. They decided to run away together. Anne would leave her husband, and they'd both return to piracy aboard a vessel Rackham would command. There was one problem. Anne was a woman, and pirate ships didn't officially accept women. Many pirates believed women aboard ships brought bad luck. More practically, women's presence could cause conflicts among male crew members competing for sexual access. So Anne adopted male disguise, just as Mary had, presenting herself as a young man joining Rackham's crew. Whether the disguise fooled all the crew members, or whether some knew the truth but agreed to pretend, is unclear. What's clear is that Anne sailed with Rackham, participated in pirate raids, and proved herself capable in combat, just as Mary would later do. This is the situation when Mary Read joined Calico Jack's crew, probably in late 1719 or very early 1720. The crew included perhaps 20 to 30 men, Anne Bonny disguised as a male crew member, and the captain, Rackham, who was Anne's lover. Mary, also disguised as male, joined this crew as another ordinary pirate. Neither woman initially knew the other's secret. They both appeared to the crew and to each other as young men. What happened next varies depending on which account you read, but the most common version, found in A General History of the Pirates, involves Anne Bonny becoming attracted to Mary Read, still believing Mary was male. Anne supposedly made advances toward Mary, which created a complicated situation. If Mary rebuffed her harshly, it might create problems within the crew, or might reveal Mary's secret. If Mary encouraged her, it would lead to situations Mary couldn't sustain. And meanwhile, Rackham apparently noticed Anne's attention toward this young male crew member and became jealous, creating tension that threatened violence. Mary decided to reveal her secret to Anne, showing her that she too was a woman disguised as a man. Anne's reaction, according to accounts, was delight and relief. Here was someone else like her, another woman who'd chosen masculine disguise and pirate life, someone who would understand her experiences in ways nobody else could. They became close friends, confidants, partners in maintaining their shared secret and in fighting alongside each other during pirate raids. Whether this story is exactly accurate or embellished for dramatic effect, what's historically certain is that both women served on Rackham's crew and that they developed an extremely close relationship. Historical records from their trial make clear that they fought together, were recognized as particularly fierce and capable fighters, and were closely associated in the minds of witnesses and authorities who later captured them. The specific details of how they met and bonded might be uncertain, but the bond itself was real. Their partnership strengthened both of them. Fighting alongside someone who shared your secret, who understood the constant vigilance required to maintain the disguise, who could watch your back both literally in combat and figuratively in protecting your identity, this must have been enormously valuable psychologically and practically. They could support each other, could share the burden of deception, could be authentic with at least one person, even while deceiving everyone else. They also apparently influenced each other's fighting styles and tactics. Witnesses who later testified at their trial described both women fighting at the front of boarding actions, both wielding cutlasses and pistols with skill, both showing courage that matched or exceeded the male pirates around them. They reportedly fought side by side frequently, coordinating their actions, covering each other during battles. This partnership made them more effective than either would have been alone. The other crew members apparently knew or suspected that both Anne and Mary were women. Maintaining perfect disguise over months of close proximity would have been nearly impossible, but they kept the secret anyway, partly because Anne was the captain's lover and Mary was Anne's close friend, so revealing them might anger Rackham. Partly because both women had proven themselves valuable crew members whose gender mattered less than their competence, and partly because pirate culture, while still masculine and often misogynistic, was more flexible about rules and norms than legitimate society. If unusual arrangements worked, pirates tended to accept them. Their fame was growing. Stories about Calico Jack's crew began mentioning that it included women pirates, though whether contemporaries fully believed these reports or dismissed them as exaggerated rumors is unclear. Pirates themselves would have known the truth through the Caribbean's informal communication networks. Colonial authorities were learning through intelligence gathering that this crew presented unusual characteristics, and captured crew members from ships Rackham's pirates attacked were reporting to authorities that they'd been robbed by pirates, including at least 2 individuals who might be women, though descriptions varied and certainty was difficult. By mid-1720, Rackham's crew was operating primarily around Jamaica, attacking fishing boats and small merchant vessels, taking prizes valuable enough to keep the crew funded, but not so large that they attracted overwhelming military response. They were successful, but not spectacularly so. Moderately competent pirates, making a living through maritime robbery while avoiding capture. Mary and Anne were integral to this operation, participating in all raids, sharing in divided plunder, living the dangerous, exciting, uncertain life that piracy offered. But their luck couldn't last forever. Piracy during the Golden Age was usually a short career. Most pirates operated for only a year or 2 before being captured, killed, or deciding to quit while they could. Governor Rogers in Nassau was aggressively hunting pirates who'd refused the pardon. Naval patrols were increasing. Colonial authorities were offering rewards for captured pirates. And pirates who'd accepted pardons were sometimes hunting their former comrades for reward money. The net was tightening around Caribbean pirates generally and around Calico Jack's crew specifically. In October 1720, that net would close. Events would unfold that would expose Mary and Anne's secret to the world, end their pirate careers, and create the dramatic trial that would make them famous. But they would also reveal something remarkable about both women: their courage under fire, their loyalty to each other, and their refusal to conform to gender expectations, even when facing death. That courage, that loyalty, that defiance, these qualities would ensure that 3 centuries later, we still remember Mary Read and Anne Bonny as 2 of history's most extraordinary women. Before we reach the dramatic events of Mary Read's capture and trial, we need to understand what her daily life as a pirate actually involved. Because beyond the exciting moments of attack and combat, piracy was also routine work: sailing, maintaining ships, navigating complex group dynamics, and following codes of conduct that governed pirate behavior. Understanding these routines and codes helps us see Mary not just as an exceptional individual, but as someone operating within specific cultural contexts that shaped her experiences and choices. Pirate ships operated under written articles, essentially contracts that all crew members agreed to when joining. These articles varied between crews, but typically covered similar topics: how plunder would be divided, what compensation crew members would receive for injuries, what behaviors were prohibited, how disputes would be resolved, and how leadership decisions would be made. These articles represented remarkable democracy for 18th century maritime culture, far more egalitarian than the rigid hierarchies on naval or merchant vessels. Typical articles included provisions like equal votes in major decisions, slightly larger shares for captains and quartermasters, but not dramatically larger, specific compensation for injuries, perhaps 600 pieces of 8 for losing a right arm, 400 for losing a left arm, proportional amounts for other injuries, prohibition of gambling, rules about women, typically prohibiting bringing women aboard, though obviously Rackham's crew violated this, and procedures for resolving disputes. Pirates who violated articles faced punishment determined by crew vote, possibly marooning on a deserted island, possibly execution, depending on offence severity. Mary operated within this system, participating in votes, receiving her share of plunders, bound by the same rules as male crew members. This egalitarian structure was one of piracy's appeals. It offered participation and voice that neither military nor civilian life provided for common people. For Mary specifically, who'd experienced subordination as a woman and as a poor person throughout her life, the relative equality of pirate crews must have been significant. She was judged on capability rather than gender or birth or education. Her vote counted equally. Her share of plunder was the same as other ordinary crew members. She'd found something rare in 18th century society, a meritocracy where performance mattered more than social categories. But we shouldn't romanticize this too much. Pirates still maintained hierarchies. Captains and quartermasters had authority, even if not absolute authority. Violence regulated disputes when voting didn't resolve them. And the fundamental business was robbery, which caused suffering for victims, regardless of how democratically pirates organized themselves. The egalitarian aspects of pirate culture were real, but existed within a fundamentally violent and criminal context. Daily life on pirate ships involved sailing routines that were boring more often than exciting. Ships needed constant maintenance, sails repaired, decks swabbed, rigging checked, pumps operated to remove water that inevitably leaked into hulls. Someone needed to steer, maintain lookout for other ships or dangerous reefs, navigate using stars and landmarks, adjust sails as winds changed. These routine tasks occupied most time, with combat and raids being relatively rare interruptions to otherwise tedious work. Food on pirate ships was poor quality, salted meat that often went bad, hardtack biscuits that became infested with weevils, whatever fish could be caught, limited fresh fruits or vegetables. Water stored in barrels became stagnant and unsafe, so pirates consumed rum partly for enjoyment, but partly because alcohol was safer than water. Disease was constant: scurvy from vitamin deficiencies, dysentery from poor hygiene, fevers from various infections. Many pirates died from disease rather than combat, and most suffered from malnutrition and various ailments that reduced their health and lifespan. For Mary, maintaining her disguise required constant vigilance. She couldn't relax her performance even during routine tasks, couldn't allow other crew members to see her in vulnerable moments that might reveal her secret. She had to participate in masculine banter and crude humour, had to urinate over the ship's rail or in buckets like male sailors did, probably finding privacy when possible, had to sleep in hammocks packed closely with others, without revealing physical characteristics that would expose her. This unrelenting performance must have been exhausting psychologically, even though it had become habitual after years of practice. Combat, when it happened, was the most dangerous and most exciting aspect of pirate life. Pirates didn't fight fairly. Their goal was to intimidate merchant crews into surrendering without resistance, minimizing risk to themselves. They'd approach potential prizes flying false flags to get close, then raise pirate flags at the last moment while firing warning shots. If merchant crews didn't immediately surrender, pirates would attack aggressively, trying to end combat quickly through overwhelming violence. Mary's reputation among pirates, and later at her trial, emphasized her combat courage. Witnesses described her as among the fiercest fighters, always at the front during boarding actions, wielding cutlass and pistols with skill that matched or exceeded male pirates. This wasn't just physical courage, though that was certainly part of it, but also tactical intelligence. Successful pirates understood when to be violent and when to show mercy, understood how to intimidate effectively, understood which fights were worth pursuing and which should be avoided. One story about Mary, possibly embellished but revealing nonetheless, involves her falling in love with another crew member, a young man who'd been captured from a merchant vessel and forced or persuaded to join Rackham's crew. This story, if true, represents Mary's third known romantic relationship. First, the Flemish soldier she'd married, then this pirate crew member. The pattern suggests Mary, despite or because of her masculine disguise, formed romantic attachments relatively easily and was willing to pursue them despite the complications they created. According to the story, this young man was challenged to a duel by another pirate over some dispute. Duels among pirates were relatively common ways of resolving conflicts without undermining crew unity. Two individuals would fight, often to death, settling their dispute personally, while others watched but didn't intervene. Mary apparently feared her lover would be killed because the other pirate was more experienced and ruthless. So she herself challenged that pirate to a duel before her lover's scheduled fight, creating a situation where she fought the dangerous opponent first. The duel supposedly took place on shore, a small island where the crew had landed, providing space for combat. Mary fought with both pistol and cutlass, and she won, defeating or possibly killing her opponent, protecting her lover from having to face him. This story illustrates several things about Mary, if true. Her willingness to risk her life for people she cared about, her confidence in her own fighting ability, and her capacity for violence when she judged it necessary. It also suggests that, despite her masculine disguise, she engaged in relationships and emotions that were conventionally feminine, falling in love, protecting someone she cared for, while employing methods that were conventionally masculine, dueling, violence, combat skill. We should note that this story comes from A General History of the Pirates, which was partly sensational entertainment mixing fact with dramatic embellishment. The duel might have happened essentially as described, might have been exaggerated, or might have been entirely invented. What's certain is that Mary had reputation among pirates as a formidable fighter, that she participated actively in combat, and that other pirates respected or feared her capabilities sufficiently that such stories seemed plausible to contemporaries. Life on Calico Jack's ship during 1719 and 1720 was probably relatively good by pirate standards. They were successful enough to keep fed and supplied, not so famous that they attracted overwhelming military attention, small enough to be mobile and flexible in choosing when to attack and when to avoid conflict. Mary and Anne's partnership strengthened the crew's effectiveness. Rackham was competent, if not brilliant. The crew seemingly worked well together. This was probably as good as pirate life got, dangerous but manageable, profitable but not spectacularly so, exciting but not constantly terrifying. But two factors made this situation unsustainable. First, colonial authorities were intensifying anti-piracy efforts throughout the Caribbean. The Golden Age was ending as governments devoted more resources to suppressing piracy. Governor Rogers in Nassau had successfully transformed that pirate haven into a legitimate British colony. Other authorities were following his example, making pirate bases increasingly difficult to maintain. The space for piracy was contracting. Second, Rackham's crew was becoming known specifically for the unusual fact that it included women pirates. This made them notorious in ways that increased danger. Authorities wanted to capture them, not just to suppress piracy, but to make examples of these gender-defying women pirates who challenged social norms in ways colonial authorities found threatening. Mary and Anne's fame, while adding to their legend, also painted targets on their backs. By October 1720, forces were converging that would end their pirate careers. A former pirate named Jonathan Barnett, who'd accepted the pardon and was now hunting pirates for reward money, had received intelligence about Rackham's location and movements. He prepared to attack, knowing his target included the famous women pirates he could capture for reward and recognition. Mary Read and Anne Bonny, despite their courage and skill, were about to face their greatest challenge. The pirate life they'd successfully navigated for months was ending. Capture was imminent, and the trial that followed would expose their secrets to the world, making them simultaneously more famous and more vulnerable than they'd ever been before. October 1720, Calico Jack Rackham's sloop, William, was anchored off the coast of Jamaica near a small bay where the crew had gone ashore. This was routine. Pirates regularly anchored in secluded bays to rest, repair ships, take on fresh water, and escape the monotony of constant sailing. The crew had been drinking, celebrating recent successful raids, relaxing in the temporary safety of their hidden anchorage. This relaxation would prove catastrophic, because at that exact moment, Jonathan Barnett was hunting them, and he was closing in. Jonathan Barnett represented something increasingly common in 1720, the reformed pirate turned pirate hunter. He'd accepted the pardon Governor Woodes Rogers had offered, had given up piracy, and now worked for colonial authorities, hunting his former colleagues for reward money. This made him particularly dangerous, because he understood pirate tactics, knew their hiding places, could anticipate their movements in ways that naval officers who'd never been pirates couldn't. When authorities commissioned him to hunt Calico Jack's crew specifically, partly because of their notoriety and partly because capturing the famous women pirates would be a spectacular prize, Barnett pursued them with determination and insider knowledge. He'd gathered intelligence about Rackham's movements through networks of informants, former pirates, and coastal residents who noticed unusual ships. He'd learned that Rackham's crew frequented certain areas around Jamaica, that they'd been spotted recently in this region, that they might be anchored in one of the small bays along the coast. Barnett commanded a well-armed sloop with a professional crew, and he approached the area carefully, checking each potential anchorage, searching systematically for his target. On the night of October 22, 1720, Barnett found them. The William was anchored in a small bay, showing minimal lights, apparently with crew members ashore or sleeping aboard. This was the perfect moment to attack. The crew was relaxed, possibly drunk, not expecting trouble. Barnett approached quietly, positioning his sloop to block escape routes, preparing to overwhelm Rackham's crew before they could organize effective resistance. What happened next became legendary not because of what the male pirates did, but because of what Mary Read and Anne Bonny did. According to testimony from Barnett's crew and from captured pirates, when Barnett's sloop attacked and most of Rackham's crew either surrendered immediately or hid below deck to avoid fighting, only 3 people resisted: Mary Read, Anne Bonny, and one male pirate whose name isn't clearly recorded. The scene must have been chaotic and terrifying. Barnett's crew, professional sailors with weapons and training, boarding the William, expecting to face desperate pirates fighting for their lives. Instead, finding most of the crew hiding or surrendering, with only 3 individuals standing to fight. 2 of those 3 were women, though Barnett's crew didn't initially realize this because Mary and Anne were still in masculine disguise, still wearing men's clothing, still presenting as male pirates. Mary and Anne fought with extraordinary courage. Witnesses described them firing pistols at the attackers, wielding cutlasses, cursing at their own crew members who were hiding instead of fighting. Anne supposedly shouted at the men below deck, challenging them to come up and fight, calling them cowards, expressing rage that the male pirates were hiding while the women fought. Mary allegedly fired down into the hold where male crew members were hiding, trying to force them to join the battle or punishing them for their cowardice. This moment, 2 women fighting desperately while male pirates hid, would become central to their legend. It challenged every assumption 18th century society held about gender and courage. Men were supposedly the brave fighters, while women were weak and fearful. Here was evidence of exactly the opposite. Women showing more courage than men, women refusing to surrender or hide, women embodying the martial virtues that society insisted only men possessed. This reversal was so dramatic, so contrary to gender expectations, that it captured public imagination and ensured that Mary and Anne would be remembered long after their male colleagues were forgotten. But courage couldn't overcome overwhelming numbers and superior position. Barnett's crew eventually subdued the resistors. Mary and Anne were captured, bound, disarmed. The male pirates who'd been hiding were discovered and captured. Calico Jack Rackham himself, who'd apparently been among those hiding or who surrendered without significant resistance, was captured. The entire crew was taken prisoner, and Barnett's triumph was complete. He'd captured not just any pirates, but the famous Calico Jack and his crew, including the legendary women pirates whose existence many people had doubted. The prisoners were transported to Spanish Town, Jamaica, where colonial authorities maintained courts capable of trying pirates under Admiralty law. The voyage to Spanish Town gave Mary and Anne time to contemplate their situation, which was dire. Piracy was a capital crime punishable by hanging. They'd been caught essentially in the act, with witnesses able to testify about their pirate activities. They had no powerful friends who might intervene on their behalf. Legal defenses for pirates were extremely limited. The evidence was usually overwhelming, and courts had strong incentive to convict because successful convictions demonstrated governmental authority and deterred future piracy. During the voyage and imprisonment, Mary and Anne's secret was revealed. Authorities examining the prisoners discovered that 2 supposed male crew members were actually women. This discovery caused sensation. Pirates were common enough that another pirate trial wouldn't be particularly noteworthy. But women pirates? That was extraordinary, unprecedented in most people's experience, shocking in ways that ensured enormous public attention. News spread quickly through Jamaica, and then throughout the Caribbean and back to Britain. Newspapers published stories about the captured women pirates, often with exaggerated or invented details, but always emphasizing the gender-defying nature of their activities. Some reports portrayed them sympathetically, as women driven to piracy by necessity or love. Others portrayed them as monsters who'd violated natural feminine roles. Still others focused on the sensational aspects, the fighting, the masculine disguise, the relationship with Calico Jack, treating them as entertainment rather than as serious criminals or as people deserving sympathy. For Mary and Anne, this publicity was double-edged. On one hand, it made them famous, ensured their story would be remembered, created public interest that might generate sympathy and potentially influence their trial. On the other hand, it increased pressure on authorities to convict and punish them severely. If they were shown mercy, authorities might appear to be condoning women who defied gender norms. Making examples of them would serve both anti-piracy goals and reinforcing gender hierarchies that their behavior had challenged. They were imprisoned separately from male pirates, held in conditions that were probably terrible even by 18th century standards. Colonial prisons were disease-ridden, unsanitary places where prisoners received minimal food and no medical care. Mary and Anne waited in these conditions while authorities prepared for their trial, gathering witnesses, assembling evidence, building cases that would ensure convictions. We don't know what they talked about during this imprisonment, whether they had opportunities to communicate with each other, what they felt as they faced probable execution. They must have known their chances were poor. They'd been caught during active piracy. Multiple witnesses could testify against them. They had no legal defenses that 18th century courts would recognize. The evidence was overwhelming. Conviction was virtually certain. But they also had one potential defense, one strategy that might at least delay execution, even if it couldn't prevent conviction: pregnancy. English law, which applied in British colonies including Jamaica, prohibited executing pregnant women. The principle was that unborn children were innocent and shouldn't be punished for their mother's crimes. If Mary and Anne were pregnant, they could plead their bellies, claim pregnancy as reason to delay execution until after childbirth. Whether they were actually pregnant or whether they claimed pregnancy strategically is debated by historians, but either way, this would become their primary defense strategy. The trial was scheduled for late November 1720. Authorities wanted to move quickly, to capitalize on public attention, to demonstrate that piracy would be punished swiftly, regardless of pirates' gender. Mary and Anne prepared as well as they could, probably without legal representation, or with only minimal assistance from attorneys who had little interest in defending pirates. They faced almost certain conviction. The only question was whether they could find some way to avoid or delay execution. The capture had ended their pirate careers, but had also begun their transformation into legend. Living pirates could be killed and forgotten. Captured pirates facing trial became historical figures whose stories would be preserved in court records, newspaper accounts, and eventually in books and popular culture. Mary Read and Anne Bonny's capture ensured their immortality, even as it threatened their lives. The woman who'd lived in disguise for years, who'd fought battles and defied expectations, was about to face her greatest challenge, not with weapons, but in a courtroom where courage mattered less than law, and where her gender, which she'd concealed so carefully for so long, would become the central fact defining her fate. November 28th, 1720. The Vice Admiralty Court in Spanish Town, Jamaica, convened for what would become one of the most famous piracy trials in history. The room was packed with spectators, colonial officials, merchants, ship captains, curious residents who'd heard about the women pirates and wanted to see them in person. Outside, crowds gathered, hoping for glimpses of the accused or news about the proceedings. This wasn't just a criminal trial. It was public spectacle, entertainment, and reinforcement of social order, all combined. The defendants sat together, but were separated by gender. Male pirates in one group, Mary Read and Anne Bonny in another. This physical separation symbolized how their gender had become the defining fact about them. They weren't just pirates being tried for crimes. They were women who'd violated gender norms, being tried in ways that emphasized their transgression of proper feminine behavior as much as their criminal activities. The presiding judge was Sir Nicholas Laws, Governor of Jamaica, who also served as the Vice Admiralty Court's chief authority. Admiralty courts had jurisdiction over maritime crimes, including piracy, and they operated under different rules than common law courts. There were no juries in Admiralty proceedings. Judges decided guilt or innocence. Rules of evidence were flexible. Defendants had minimal rights compared to trials in England itself. This system was designed to process piracy cases efficiently, ensuring swift justice that would deter future piracy through certainty and speed of punishment. The charges against all defendants were straightforward: piracy and robbery on the high seas, specifically relating to attacks on fishing vessels and merchant ships in Jamaican waters during September and October 1720. The prosecution presented witnesses who'd been victims of these attacks, fishermen whose boats had been taken, merchants whose goods had been stolen, captains whose vessels had been attacked. These witnesses testified about the attacks, described the pirates' actions, and crucially, identified specific defendants including Mary Read and Anne Bonny. The testimony revealed details about Mary and Anne's participation that made clear they weren't passive passengers on a pirate ship, but active participants in attacks. Witnesses described seeing them during raids, wearing men's clothing, carrying weapons, participating in fighting. One witness testified that they wore men's jackets and long trousers and handkerchiefs tied about their heads, and that each of them had a machete and pistol in their hands. Another witness stated that Mary and Anne were very active on board and willing to do anything, that they fought alongside male pirates and showed no indication of being less capable or committed than the men. Perhaps most damaging was testimony about their behavior during attacks. Dorothy Thomas, a woman who'd been on a vessel Rackham's crew attacked, testified specifically about Anne Bonny, stating that Anne wore men's clothes and cursed and swore, and was very active during the attack. This testimony was devastating not just legally, but socially. It confirmed that Anne and Mary hadn't just dressed as men, but had adopted masculine behaviors, including violence, cursing, and aggressive conduct that violated every norm about proper feminine behavior. The male pirates tried various defenses, claiming they'd been forced to join the crew, arguing they'd been too drunk during attacks to be responsible, suggesting they'd planned to leave piracy soon. These defenses were weak and unconvincing. The evidence against all defendants was overwhelming. Witnesses were clear and consistent. The defendants had been captured during active piracy. Conviction was virtually inevitable. Mary and Anne had an additional complication beyond the evidence against them. Their gender made them simultaneously more sympathetic and more threatening to authorities. On one hand, some spectators and potentially even some judges might feel reluctant to hang women, might see them as victims of Rackham's influence, or as women driven to desperate measures by circumstances. On the other hand, women who'd so flagrantly violated gender norms might seem especially dangerous, might require especially severe punishment to deter other women from similar transgressions. The trial proceedings emphasized their gender violations repeatedly. The prosecution highlighted not just their criminal acts, but their masculine dress, their fighting ability, their cursing, and aggressive behavior. This wasn't legally relevant to their guilt. Piracy was piracy regardless of the pirate's gender, but it served to reinforce social messages about how dangerous it was when women refused feminine roles. The trial was teaching a lesson not just about piracy's consequences, but about gender transgression's consequences. Rackham and other male defendants were tried first, probably because their cases were more straightforward. The evidence was presented, witnesses testified, judges deliberated briefly, and verdicts were announced. Guilty on all charges. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out quickly. Rackham reportedly showed little emotion upon hearing the verdict, perhaps because it was exactly what he'd expected. He'd been a pirate for years, had certainly known the potential consequences, and now faced them with whatever dignity or resignation he could muster. Mary and Anne's trial followed similar patterns, but with additional attention focused on their gender. The prosecution made the same case. They participated in piracy. Witnesses could identify them. The evidence was overwhelming. The defense had little to work with except to argue for mercy, to suggest that as women they deserved more lenient treatment, to emphasize that they'd been influenced by Rackham rather than operating independently. These arguments were legally weak, but potentially emotionally effective if judges or spectators felt sympathetic toward women pirates. The verdict was announced, guilty on all charges. The sentence, death by hanging. The same sentence the male pirates received. The law made no distinction based on gender for capital crimes. Piracy was punished by death, whether committed by men or women. Mary and Anne had demanded to be treated as equals to men throughout their pirate careers. Now the court was treating them as equals in punishment. But then came the dramatic moment that would save their lives, at least temporarily. When asked if they had anything to say before sentence was formally imposed, both women responded with the same phrase. "My lord, we plead our bellies." They were claiming pregnancy, invoking the legal principle that pregnant women couldn't be executed until after childbirth because unborn children were innocent and shouldn't be punished for their mother's crimes. The courtroom erupted. This was unexpected, dramatic, and legally significant. If they were pregnant, execution had to be delayed, regardless of guilt. But were they actually pregnant? Or were they claiming it strategically? The court had to determine pregnancy's existence before proceeding, which required medical examination. English law provided procedures for this situation. A jury of matrons, experienced women, often midwives or mothers, who could recognize pregnancy's signs, would examine the defendants and report to the court. This jury was assembled quickly, probably from women in Spanish Town who had relevant experience. Mary and Anne were examined, likely in humiliating and invasive ways, given 18th century medical understanding and the limited privacy afforded to criminals. The jury of matrons returned their verdict. Both women were indeed pregnant, or at least showed signs that the matrons interpreted as pregnancy. Whether they were actually pregnant is debated by historians. Anne Bonny had been involved with Rackham for months or years, so pregnancy was certainly plausible. Mary's situation is less clear. She might have been involved with the young crew member from the Jewel story, or she might have been with someone else, or she might not have been pregnant at all, but showed symptoms that matrons interpreted as pregnancy. Regardless of the truth, the legal effect was clear. Their executions were postponed. They would remain imprisoned until after childbirth, at which point the sentences could be carried out. This postponement, while not a pardon or acquittal, gave them time. Time to live, time for circumstances to change, time for potential interventions or escapes, or simply more weeks or months of existence that they wouldn't have had if executed immediately. The male pirates received no such reprieve. Within days of their convictions, they were hanged at Gallows Point in Port Royal, the traditional execution site for pirates. Their bodies were displayed in public, hanging in cages as warnings to other potential pirates. Calico Jack Rackham who'd commanded the crew and whose romantic involvement with Anne Bonny had been widely known, was among those executed. Anne reportedly was allowed to visit him shortly before his execution, though accounts of what they said vary. She supposedly told him that she was sorry to see him there, but that, if he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog. Whether she actually said this, or whether it was invented to make her seem appropriately harsh toward cowardice, the quote captured public imagination and became part of the legend. Mary and Anne remained imprisoned while the male pirates died. They watched their colleagues and friends executed, understanding that the same fate awaited them once their pregnancies ended. They lived in terrible prison conditions, uncertain how long they had, unsure whether pregnancy claims would truly protect them, or whether authorities might find ways to execute them anyway. Their trial had made them famous, but hadn't saved them. The legend was growing, but their lives remained in desperate peril. What happened next, in the terrible months of imprisonment awaiting childbirth and potential execution, would complete Mary Read's extraordinary story in a way that was simultaneously tragic and fitting for someone whose entire life had defied expectations. After their trial and sentencing, Mary Read and Anne Bonny disappeared from public view into the grim reality of colonial imprisonment. The courtroom drama had ended, the spectacle was over, but their suffering had just begun. Colonial prisons in 1720 were nightmarish places, even by 18th century standards, and pregnant women facing eventual execution received no special accommodations that might make imprisonment more bearable. To understand Mary's final months, we need to understand what colonial imprisonment actually meant and how it reflected broader attitudes toward criminals, women, and people who'd violated social norms. The prison in Spanish Town, where Mary and Anne were held, wasn't designed for long-term incarceration. Colonial Jamaica's primary punishment for serious crimes was execution, not imprisonment. Prisons served mainly as holding facilities, where accused people waited for trial and where convicted people waited for execution or other punishment. They weren't meant to be comfortable or rehabilitative. They were meant to contain people cheaply while society decided what to do with them. The physical conditions were terrible. Prisoners were held in small, dark, poorly ventilated cells or in larger common rooms where multiple prisoners lived together with minimal supervision. Sanitation was primitive. Buckets for waste that were emptied irregularly. No clean water for washing. No way to maintain even basic hygiene. In Jamaica's tropical heat, these conditions bred disease rapidly. Fever, dysentery, infections, all were common among prisoners. Many people who were sentenced to hang actually died in prison before execution, which authorities viewed as acceptable. Death was death, regardless of whether it came from disease or the noose. Food provided to prisoners was minimal and of poor quality. Authorities gave prisoners just enough to keep them barely alive, reasoning that anything more was wasteful since prisoners were criminals who deserved suffering. Mary and Anne received perhaps some bread, some thin soup, occasionally some salted meat or fish. Never enough for adequate nutrition, especially problematic for pregnant women who needed more food to sustain both themselves and their growing fetuses. They had no meaningful medical care. Even in the outside world, pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous, killing significant numbers of women and infants. In prison, without proper nutrition, without clean conditions, without skilled midwives or doctors, pregnancy was even more dangerous. Mary and Anne faced the likelihood that pregnancy itself might kill them before they could be executed, that they might die giving birth in prison, surrounded by disease and filth, that their children might be stillborn or die shortly after birth. The pregnancy that had saved them from immediate execution might ultimately kill them just as certainly as the noose would have. We don't know exactly how they spent their time during imprisonment. Did they talk to each other? Were they kept together or separately? Did they have visitors? Could they communicate with anyone outside? Historical records don't provide these details. What we know is that they waited for childbirth, for whatever would happen after, for fate to determine whether they'd live or die, and in what manner. Their fame continued growing outside prison walls. The trial had generated enormous publicity, and interest in the women pirates remained high. Newspapers throughout the Caribbean and Britain continued publishing stories about them, often inventing or embellishing details when facts weren't available. Books were already being written that would include accounts of their lives, most notably A General History of the Pirates, which would be published in 1724 and would ensure their place in popular culture for centuries afterward. But fame couldn't protect them from prison conditions or from the fate that awaited them. They were still condemned criminals, waiting to be hanged once pregnancy ended. The attention they received probably made authorities more determined to execute them eventually. Showing mercy to famous criminals might appear as weakness, might suggest that gender or notoriety could earn special treatment that ordinary criminals didn't receive. The legal situation regarding their pregnancies was complex and uncertain. English law prohibited executing pregnant women, but what happened after childbirth was less clear. Theoretically, once they gave birth, the executions could proceed immediately. But would authorities actually hang women who'd just given birth? Would there be any grace period allowing recovery? Would motherhood create additional legal complications if the children survived? Nobody knew exactly how this would play out because women pirates were so rare that there was little precedent for how to handle them. Mary's pregnancy progressed through the terrible months of late 1720 and early 1721. We don't know if she felt the baby moving, if she thought about motherhood, if she considered what it meant to carry a child who might never know freedom, who might die with her or shortly after her, who existed only as a complication in a criminal case rather than as a wanted child with a future. These are questions we can't answer because Mary left no written record of her thoughts or feelings during this time. Then, in April 1721, something happened that would spare Mary from execution, not through pardon or mercy, but through the same mechanism that had killed so many other prisoners: disease. Mary became severely ill with what contemporary accounts describe as a fever. This might have been one of many diseases common in tropical prisons: typhoid, dysentery, malaria, or various infections that flourished in the unsanitary, crowded, hot conditions. Whatever the specific pathogen, it attacked her weakened body brutally. She didn't recover. On April 28, 1721, approximately 6 months after her capture and trial, Mary Read died in prison. She was probably in her mid-30s, though her exact age is uncertain. She'd survived childhood poverty, military service in 2 branches, years as an outlaw pirate, capture and trial, only to be killed by disease in a colonial prison while awaiting execution. Her death certificate, if it existed in modern sense, would have recorded simply, Mary Read, pirate. The baby she'd been carrying died with her, either before her death through miscarriage or stillbirth, or at the moment of her death. No records mention a surviving child, which strongly suggests the pregnancy ended without a living birth. Whether the pregnancy had been real or strategic didn't matter in the end. It had delayed her execution long enough that disease killed her first, sparing her the noose, but not sparing her from terrible suffering. Anne Bonny survived. Her fate after imprisonment is mysterious and disputed by historians. Some accounts claim she also died in prison, either from disease or complications of childbirth. Others claim she was eventually released, possibly after her wealthy father in South Carolina intervened politically, possibly after serving additional time beyond her pregnancy, possibly through mechanisms that historical records don't clearly document. Still, other accounts, probably romantic inventions, claim she returned to piracy or lived quietly under an assumed name. The most credible evidence suggests Anne survived imprisonment but disappeared from historical record afterward, probably living under a different name, avoiding publicity that might bring unwanted attention to her criminal past. She apparently never faced execution. The pregnancy claim had worked for her, even though it ultimately hadn't saved Mary. But her survival meant the partnership was broken. Mary was gone, their brief friendship ended by disease and imprisonment, and Anne faced whatever came next alone. Mary's death marked the end of her extraordinary life, but not the end of her legend. The woman who'd been forced to live as a boy from childhood, who'd served in army and navy disguised as male, who'd married and been widowed and returned to masculine disguise, who'd become a pirate and fought with courage equal to any man, who defied every expectation 18th century society had for women. That woman was gone. But her story remained, told and retold, embellished and debated, inspiring and shocking people across centuries. The prison authorities probably viewed her death as convenient. It solved the problem of what to do with a famous woman pirate, without requiring authorities to make difficult decisions about execution timing, or to risk public backlash if they hanged a woman who'd just given birth or who was still pregnant. Disease had done what the law couldn't easily do, removed her from the world, ended her story, closed her case. She was buried somewhere, probably in an unmarked grave or in a common burial ground for prisoners and paupers, with no ceremony or monument acknowledging who she'd been or what she'd accomplished. But unmarked graves don't contain legends. Stories don't die when their subjects do. And Mary Read's story, the sheer audacity of her life, the courage she demonstrated, the gender norms she shattered, the proof she provided that women could be as capable as men in any arena if given opportunity, that story couldn't be buried. It survived, evolved, inspired, and continues to fascinate us 3 centuries later. Mary died alone in a colonial prison, but her legend has lived in books and imaginations ever since, refusing to be forgotten, insisting that her life mattered, demanding that we remember the woman who showed the world that courage, capability, and determination have no gender. Her body failed, but her legend proved immortal. Mary Read died in obscurity in a colonial prison, buried without ceremony in an unmarked grave. But within just 3 years of her death, her story began its transformation into legend through publication of one of the most influential books about piracy ever written, A General History of the Pirates. This book, published in 1724 and attributed to Captain Charles Johnson, possibly a pseudonym for Daniel Defoe, though scholars debate this, included detailed accounts of Mary Read's and Anne Bonny's lives that ensured their names would be remembered long after most male pirates were forgotten. To understand how the legend emerged, we need to understand this book and why it mattered so much. The early 18th century was a period of massive growth in literacy and publishing. More people could read than ever before, and there was enormous appetite for entertaining, sensational material. Pirates were perfect subjects. They were real. Their activities were recent enough to seem current. They operated outside social norms in ways that were simultaneously shocking and fascinating. And their stories involved adventure, violence, exotic locations, and moral ambiguity that made for compelling reading. A General History of the Pirates capitalized on this appetite brilliantly. It combined factual information from trial records, newspaper accounts, and testimony from captured pirates, with novelistic embellishments, dramatic dialogue, and character development that made pirates seem like heroes from adventure novels rather than common criminals. The book was enormously successful, going through multiple editions, being translated into other languages, and influencing how people thought about pirates for centuries afterward. The chapters on Mary Read and Anne Bonny were particularly sensational because they combined piracy's inherent drama with gender transgression's shocking nature. The book presented their stories in ways that emphasized both their capabilities. They fought as bravely as men. They succeeded in masculine occupations. They proved women could do everything men could. And their violations of proper feminine behavior. They wore men's clothes. They cursed and fought. They lived violently outside social structures that were supposed to contain women's activities. The author portrayed Mary sympathetically, while also making her seem exotic and dangerous. The book described her childhood disguise, her military service, her marriage, her return to disguise, her piracy career. It included the story about her dueling to protect her lover, emphasizing her romantic nature alongside her warrior capabilities. It described her trial and imprisonment and death in ways that made her tragic rather than simply criminal. The overall effect was to make Mary a compelling character, someone readers could sympathize with despite her crimes, someone whose life seemed meaningful and dramatic rather than just sordid. But the book also contained moral lessons that made Mary's story acceptable to 18th century audiences despite its transgressive elements. It emphasized that her masculine disguise and piracy began from necessity, from poverty and desperation, rather than from choice or preference. It suggested that she would have preferred a conventional feminine life if circumstances had permitted. It portrayed her death as almost divine punishment for her gender violations and crimes, teaching readers that transgression ultimately leads to suffering. These moral frames made the story simultaneously exciting and socially conservative, allowing readers to enjoy the transgression vicariously while being reassured that traditional morality ultimately prevailed. The book's success meant that Mary's story reached huge audiences throughout the English-speaking world and beyond. People who'd never heard of her during her lifetime learned about her after her death. Readers in London, Edinburgh, Boston, Charleston, and dozens of other cities encountered the woman pirate who defied every expectation, who'd fought alongside men as an equal, who'd proved that gender limitations were social constructions rather than natural inevitabilities. The book planted Mary's legend in popular consciousness, where it would grow and evolve for centuries. Other publications followed. Newspapers and magazines reprinted stories about Mary and Anne. Playwrights wrote dramatic versions of their stories for theatre. Artists created illustrations depicting them in action, fighting on deck, standing defiantly at trial, presenting themselves in ways that emphasized both their femininity and their martial prowess. These various retellings sometimes contradicted each other in details. Dates shifted, names changed, events were added or subtracted. But they all reinforce the core legend. Women pirates who challenged gender norms and lived extraordinary lives. The legend evolved differently in different contexts. In England and its colonies, Mary's story was often told as a cautionary tale about the dangers of women abandoning proper roles. She transgressed, suffered, died, exactly what happened to women who rejected femininity. But the underlying message was complicated by the fact that Mary was also portrayed as brave, capable, and admirable. The attempt to use her story as moral warning was undermined by the undeniable fact that readers found her fascinating and impressive. In America, particularly as women's rights movements developed in the 19th and 20th centuries, Mary became an inspiration rather than a warning. Suffragists and feminists pointed to her as historical proof that women could do anything men could if given opportunity, that gender limitations were social impositions rather than natural facts. The same story that had been told as moral warning in the 18th century became empowerment narrative in later periods. Academic historians struggled with how to treat Mary. Some dismissed her story as largely fictional, arguing that a general history of the pirates was unreliable because of its novelistic embellishments. Others argued that while specific details might be invented, the core facts that women pirates existed, that Mary Read and Anne Bonny were real people, tried and convicted, was supported by court records and contemporary documentation. This debate continues among historians today, with most scholarly consensus being that Mary and Anne were real, but that many details about their lives are uncertain or embellished. What's not debatable is the legend's cultural impact. Mary Read became one of history's most famous women pirates, arguably the most famous alongside Anne Bonny and perhaps Grace O'Malley. Her story appeared in countless books, articles, and eventually films, television shows, and video games. She became a character in fiction, sometimes accurately portrayed based on historical sources, sometimes wildly fictionalized to serve storytellers' purposes. The historical Mary Read and the legendary Mary Read diverged increasingly, but both versions remained culturally significant. The legend's persistence requires explanation. Why does Mary Read remain famous 300 years after her death, when thousands of male pirates from the same era are completely forgotten? Part of the answer is simply that women pirates were rare enough to be remarkable. Uniqueness aids memorability. But there's more to it than just rarity. Mary's story resonates because it addresses fundamental questions about gender, capability, social roles, and human potential that remain relevant across centuries. Her life demonstrated that gender roles are enforced through social pressure rather than natural inevitability. She proved she could do everything society insisted only men could do: fight, sail, survive in exclusively masculine environments, which meant that gender limitations were ideological rather than biological. This proof threatened 18th century society's gender hierarchies, which is why authorities treated her transgressions so seriously. But it also inspired people who believed gender equality was possible and just, which is why her legend has been celebrated by progressive movements for 2 centuries. The legend also serves psychological functions for people navigating their own gender identities and social expectations. Mary's story about living in masculine disguise, about being one gender internally while presenting as another externally, about the complicated relationship between biological sex and social gender. These themes resonate particularly strongly in contemporary discussions about transgender identity, gender performance, and the distinction between sex and gender. While we can't know how Mary understood her own gender identity, whether she felt like a woman performing masculinity or whether she identified more genuinely as masculine, her story provides historical precedent for people whose gender identities don't match simple male-female binaries. Popular culture has embraced Mary repeatedly. The Assassin's Creed video game series includes her as a major character. Novels set during the Golden Age of Piracy frequently feature her. Films about pirates reference her, even when not depicting her directly. Television shows about strong women protagonists sometimes invoke her as inspiration. This continued cultural presence means that new generations encounter her legend, ensuring it doesn't fade despite the centuries separating us from her actual life. But we should also acknowledge what the legend obscures or simplifies. The real Mary Read probably experienced enormous psychological stress, maintaining her disguise for years, faced constant danger and violence, participated in activities that harmed innocent people, regardless of her motivations, died miserably in terrible conditions, without seeing any of the positive outcomes her legend claims for her. The legend makes her life seem exciting and meaningful. The reality was probably often frightening, painful, and morally compromising. Celebrating the legend shouldn't require us to ignore the suffering the real person likely experienced. The legend also exists in tension with historical fact. We don't actually know much about Mary's inner life, her motivations, her thoughts and feelings. The details in A General History of the Pirates and subsequent accounts are partly invented. When we talk about Mary Read, we're often talking about a fictionalized character, constructed from fragmentary historical evidence plus 3 centuries of storytelling and interpretation. This doesn't make the legend worthless. Legends serve important cultural functions, even when historically questionable. But it means we should maintain some skepticism about claims to know definitively who Mary was or what she believed. What we can say with confidence is that Mary Read, the historical person, did exist, did participate in piracy, did dress as a man, did fight in combat, did face trial and imprisonment, and did die in a colonial prison. Beyond these basic facts, we move into legend, stories that might be true, that serve important functions regardless of their factual accuracy, that have shaped how people think about gender and capability and courage for 3 centuries. That legend, whether perfectly accurate or not, has proven to be one of the Golden Age of Piracy's most enduring legacies. The woman died, but the story lives, continuing to inspire, challenge, and fascinate everyone who encounters it. We've reached the end of our journey through Mary Read's life and legend, and now we face the most important questions. What does her story mean? Why should we care about a pirate who died 300 years ago? What can Mary Read teach us about gender, identity, courage, and the human capacity to transcend the limitations society imposes? These aren't just historical questions, but questions about how we understand ourselves and our world today. Let's start with the historical context we've explored throughout these episodes. The early 18th century was a period of rigid gender hierarchies where women's roles were severely constrained by law, custom, religion, and economic structures. Women couldn't vote, couldn't own property after marriage, couldn't enter most professions, couldn't receive equal education, couldn't live independently without male protection. Society insisted that these limitations were natural, that women were inherently inferior to men in intelligence, courage, physical capability, moral judgment, everything except perhaps emotional sensitivity and domestic skills. Mary Read's life demolished these assumptions. She proved that women could fight as bravely as men, could endure hardship as well as men, could think tactically and strategically as effectively as men, could command respect in masculine environments if allowed to participate. She didn't prove this through argument or theory, but through living demonstration. She actually did the things society insisted women couldn't do. This made her both inspiring to people who believed in gender equality and threatening to people who relied on gender hierarchies to maintain social order. The fact that she had to disguise herself as male to access opportunities reveals the fundamental injustice she challenged. Mary apparently had capabilities that would have made her successful in military service or maritime careers or other occupations. But as a woman, she couldn't legally enter those fields. She could only participate by pretending to be male, by concealing her actual gender, by accepting that society wouldn't allow her true self to do what her abilities qualified her for. This forced deception highlights how gender restrictions harm not just women, but society generally. How much talent and capability is wasted when we limit people based on gender, rather than judging them on merit. Her story also raises complicated questions about gender identity itself. Was Mary a woman performing masculinity, or was she in some sense genuinely masculine, regardless of her biological sex? Did she identify as female, but adopt male presentation strategically? Or did living as male for most of her life create a more complex gender identity that doesn't fit neatly into either category? We can't answer these questions definitively because Mary left no personal account of her inner experience. But asking them helps us recognize that gender is more complex than simple male-female binary suggests. Modern discussions of transgender identity and gender performance find interesting historical parallels in Mary's story. People who experience disconnect between their biological sex and their gender identity, who feel that their true selves don't match the gender they were assigned at birth, who navigate the world through complex negotiations between inner identity and outer presentation. These people might see something familiar in Mary's experiences. While we can't know if Mary would have identified as transgender using modern terminology, her life demonstrates that living between or outside conventional gender categories is historically documented, not a recent phenomenon. The pirate dimension of her story matters too. Piracy wasn't just crime, but a form of resistance against economic and political systems that created enormous inequality. The Golden Age of Piracy occurred because maritime commerce generated massive wealth that was distributed extremely unequally, creating desperate populations with few legal ways to improve their conditions. Pirates were criminals, yes, but they were also people challenging economic systems that exploited them, demanding better treatment than legitimate society offered, creating alternative communities with more democratic governance than most conventional societies provided. Mary's participation in piracy can be understood partly as extension of her gender transgression. She was already living outside conventional society by refusing feminine roles, so joining pirates who lived outside conventional society more broadly made sense. But it also represented practical choice. Piracy offered opportunities for women that legitimate society absolutely didn't. As a pirate, she could fight, sail, earn shares of plunder, participate in democratic decision-making. As a woman in conventional society, she could basically only marry, serve domestically, or starve. Piracy's illegality was the price of its relative gender equality. But we shouldn't romanticize piracy too much. Pirates harmed innocent people through robbery and violence. They operated outside legal systems that, however imperfect, provided some protections and procedures that piracy lacked. The democratic aspects of pirate culture coexisted with brutality, instability, and short life expectancies. Mary might have found more freedom in piracy than in conventional society, but that freedom came at terrible costs, including her early death in terrible circumstances. Her relationship with Anne Bonny represents another significant aspect of her legacy. Two women finding each other in masculine disguise, forming close friendship and fighting partnership, supporting each other through challenges nobody else could fully understand. This partnership demonstrated the importance of solidarity among people facing similar struggles. Whether their relationship was purely platonic, or whether it had romantic dimensions that contemporaries wouldn't have acknowledged, or that historical sources wouldn't have recorded clearly, it represents a powerful bond between women who defied expectations together. The way Mary's story has been told and retold across 3 centuries reveals how societies use historical figures to work through contemporary concerns. In the 18th century, her story was a cautionary tale about gender transgression's dangers. In the 19th century, it became evidence for early feminists arguing that women deserved more rights and opportunities. In the 20th century, it inspired conversations about gender performance and identity. In the 21st century, it contributes to discussions about transgender rights and non-binary gender identities. The same basic historical facts have been interpreted differently depending on what questions each era needed to answer. This adaptability is part of why the legend endures. Mary Read's story is flexible enough to serve multiple purposes, to mean different things to different people, to address evolving concerns about gender and identity and justice. As long as societies struggle with gender equality, as long as people face limitations based on gender rather than capability, as long as questions about identity and authenticity remain relevant, Mary's story will continue resonating with new audiences who find in it reflections of their own struggles and aspirations. Contemporary popular culture's embrace of Mary demonstrates the legend's continued vitality. Video games let players experience piracy from her perspective. Novels reimagine her life with varying degrees of historical accuracy. Films about strong women protagonists invoke her as inspiration. Historical tours in the Caribbean mention her among famous pirates. All of this keeps her memory alive and introduces her story to people who might never read historical accounts, but who encounter her through entertainment and popular culture. We should also consider what her story teaches about courage. Mary repeatedly faced situations where courage was required, revealing her gender to her first husband despite enormous risk, fighting in combat when hiding would have been safer, resisting capture when surrender would have been easier, maintaining dignity at trial when pleading for mercy might have helped. Her courage wasn't reckless or foolish, but calculated. She took risks when she judged them worth taking. She fought when fighting seemed meaningful. She refused to accept limitations that she believed were unjust. This kind of principled courage, courage in service of autonomy and dignity rather than courage for its own sake, is what makes her admirable beyond the mere sensationalism of her story. Her death reminds us that courage doesn't guarantee happy endings. Mary lived extraordinarily, defied expectations, achieved things society insisted were impossible for women. And she died miserably in prison at a relatively young age, without wealth or comfort, or seeing any lasting change result from her transgression. The legend has a happy ending in the sense that she's remembered and celebrated. But her actual life ended tragically, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. Honoring her memory requires acknowledging both the extraordinary nature of her achievements and the terrible price she paid for them. What, ultimately, should we conclude about Mary Read? Perhaps that she was a woman who refused to accept the limitations her society placed on her gender, who was willing to live dangerously and deceptively to access opportunities that should have been available honestly, who proved through her life that gender restrictions were unjust impositions rather than natural inevitabilities. She wasn't perfect. She was a pirate who participated in crimes, someone whose methods were morally questionable, even if her goals of autonomy and survival were understandable. But her imperfections make her more human and more interesting than simplified heroic narratives would allow. Her legacy is that women can do anything men can do if given opportunity, that gender is more complex than simple binaries suggest, that courage means refusing to accept unjust limitations, even when refusal carries enormous costs, that people who challenge social norms deserve recognition, even when they also deserve criticism for specific actions. These lessons remain relevant 3 centuries after her death, because gender inequality, questions about identity, tensions between individual autonomy and social order, all of these persist in different forms. Mary Read, the historical person, lived briefly, suffered greatly, achieved remarkably under terrible constraints, and died without knowing she'd be remembered. Mary Read, the legend, has lived for 3 centuries, inspired countless people, challenged gender assumptions across generations, and shows no signs of being forgotten. The woman is gone, but the story remains, continuing to teach, inspire, and challenge everyone who encounters it. Perhaps that's the most appropriate legacy for someone who spent her entire life refusing to be forgotten, insisting on being recognized, demanding that her capabilities be acknowledged, regardless of what society said women could or couldn't do. the pirate who defied everything: gender expectations, social norms, conventional morality, comfortable narratives. Ultimately defied even death itself by becoming immortal through legend. Mary Read's body lies in an unmarked grave somewhere in Jamaica, but her spirit, the essence of what she represented and fought for, lives in every person who refuses to accept limitations based on who they are rather than what they can do. And that legacy, 300 years after her death, remains as vital and challenging as it was during her extraordinary life.